The late afternoon sun bathed the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, California, in a golden hue. The flags fluttered lightly in the Pacific breeze, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shoreline mixed with the hum of distant helicopters. It was the annual Navy SEAL reunion, a rare day when warriors came not to fight, but to remember. Men in sharp uniforms mingled with veterans in worn jackets, some leaning on canes, others walking with that quiet confidence that never faded. Tables were lined with photographs, snapshots from dusty battlefields, black and white portraits of young faces hardened by time. Wives shared stories, children played tag, and laughter echoed across the courtyard. Rear Admiral Thomas Blake adjusted the medals on his chest as he scanned the crowd. He was in his early 50s, tall, still fit, and carried himself with the easy authority of a man who had spent decades commanding others. His career had been distinguished, leadership in multiple deployments, a few scars, and a reputation for being approachable, yet sharp-tongued. Blake was the kind of leader who joked with his men, but demanded perfection when the time came. Today, however, was about celebration, not command. He raised his glass as he spoke with an old teammate, Commander Harris, laughing at stories of their first deployment in Iraq. "Remember that time you ordered a drone strike on your own tent?" Blake teased. Harris snorted. "You were the one who gave me the wrong coordinates, sir." The two men laughed, their camaraderie genuine, their bond unspoken yet unbreakable. Around them, officers chatted with families, and recruits stared wide-eyed at their heroes. It was then, in the middle of the warm chaos, that Blake's eyes caught something, or rather, someone. Near the far edge of the courtyard, standing beneath the shade of a flagpole, was a man who didn't quite fit in with the rest. He wasn't in uniform, but even in civilian clothes, a plain gray shirt and worn jeans, there was something unmistakably military about him. His posture was too straight, his eyes too observant. His hands were clasped behind his back, fingers resting lightly, as though he were still standing at parade rest. Beside him stood a younger man, early 30s, wearing his SEAL insignia proudly. The younger one laughed occasionally with passing comrades, but the older man simply nodded or smiled faintly, saying little. There was a quiet aura about him, not arrogance, but weight, like he carried something the others couldn't see. "Who's that?" Blake asked, motioning toward them. Harris squinted. "Not sure. The younger guy's Lieutenant Mason, I think. Good operator, solid record. His dad, maybe?" Blake tilted his head. "He's got the look of someone who's seen more than a few deployments." "Yeah," Harris said thoughtfully, "but I don't recognize him from any reunion lists." Blake shrugged. "Maybe an old-timer. We get plenty of ghosts from the past showing up here." The Admiral chuckled at his own joke and moved on, shaking hands, posing for photos, and giving short speeches to families who thanked him for his service. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the man by the flagpole. There was something about his stillness, not awkwardness, but calm. The kind of calm that only came from years of chaos. As the ceremony began, the crowd gathered near the stage. The master of ceremonies, a retired captain, gave a heartfelt introduction before handing the microphone to Admiral Blake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, his voice steady and confident, "today we don't celebrate rank or medals. We celebrate the brotherhood that defines us, the bond forged in places most people can't even pronounce." The audience applauded. Blake continued, mixing humor and sincerity with the ease of a seasoned speaker. He honored the fallen, praised the young recruits, and cracked a few jokes about Navy coffee being tougher than basic training. The crowd laughed, cheering when he raised his glass to those who never came home but never left our hearts. When the speeches ended, the mood lightened again. Music played softly, children ran between the legs of old soldiers, and food stations opened along the courtyard. Blake stepped down from the podium, eager for something to eat and a few light-hearted conversations. As he moved through the crowd, his path crossed once again with the quiet man and his son. Up close, the older man's presence was even more striking. His hair was silver, cut short, his face lined but strong. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that had seen too much dust, too much distance, and too many decisions made in silence. Blake smiled, extending a friendly hand. "Good evening, gentlemen. Lieutenant Mason, right?" "Yes, sir," the younger man replied quickly, snapping to attention before relaxing. "Glad to see you here, Admiral." Blake nodded. "And you must be his father?" The older man shook his hand firmly. "That's right. David Mason." "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Mason," Blake said warmly. "Your son's a fine officer. One of our best." David gave a polite nod. "He's earned his place." Something about the man's voice, calm, measured, and deep, caught Blake off guard. It wasn't the voice of a civilian bragging about his son. It was the voice of someone who had once given orders. "So," Blake said conversationally, "you ever serve yourself?" "You've got that look." David smiled faintly. "A long time ago." "Oh?" Blake grinned. "Let me guess, Marines?" "SEALs," David replied simply. Blake chuckled. "Well, I'll be damned. Another frogman in the family. That explains a lot." He turned to the nearby officers who had joined the conversation. "This guy's probably got more sea stories than all of us combined." David said nothing. His expression remained calm, but his silence made Blake curious. There was no hint of pride or nostalgia, just stillness. Blake decided to tease him, light-heartedly, as he often did with old veterans. "Come on, you've got to tell me your call sign," he said with a grin. "Every SEAL's got one. What did they call you back in your day?" A few nearby officers laughed. The Admiral's easy charm was contagious. David's son, however, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, maybe." Blake waved him off. "Relax, Lieutenant. We're all brothers here. I'm just making conversation." The air around them changed, subtly but unmistakably. David looked up, meeting Blake's eyes for the first time. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it carried a depth that made even the Admiral straighten slightly. For a moment, no one spoke. The laughter died down. The soft hum of the crowd seemed to fade into the distance. Then David spoke, his voice steady and low. "They used to call me Iron Ghost." The words landed like a thunderclap. Blake blinked. The officers around them went still. One of them, a senior chief, actually gasped softly. The name wasn't just familiar. It was legendary. Iron Ghost was a name whispered in training rooms, spoken only in stories of impossible missions. Blake felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Wait," he said slowly. "You're him?" David gave a small nod, almost apologetic. "I was." No one spoke. Blake's mind raced. He remembered reading mission reports, learning about an operator who'd single-handedly rescued a captured team deep in enemy territory, who'd vanished for months only to reappear without a scratch. Half the Navy thought he'd died. The other half believed he was a myth. And now he was standing right there, quietly, humbly, beside his son. Blake swallowed hard. His earlier humor evaporated. "Mr. Mason," he said softly, "it's an honor, sir." David nodded once more. "Just David," he said. "I'm just here for my boy." Blake didn't press further. For the first time that day, he felt small, not out of shame, but out of awe. He realized that real heroes rarely needed to say who they were. And as the music played on and laughter resumed elsewhere, one truth hung silently in the air. The ghost of a legend had just stepped out of the shadows. The music from the reunion drifted into the evening like a faint hum of memories. Laughter and brass band notes, mingled with the salty breeze. Admiral Thomas Blake stood near one of the long tables, paper plate in hand, but his appetite had vanished. The words still echoed in his head. They used to call me Iron Ghost. He replayed that instant, the pause, the weight in the veteran's voice, the silence that had swallowed the crowd. For a man whose career was built on control, the feeling of being caught off guard unsettled him. Blake had faced ambushes, survived night raids, and briefed admirals in the Pentagon's coldest rooms, yet 3 simple words from a quiet stranger had frozen him. He forced a grin as a junior officer approached. "Sir, burgers are running out. Want me to grab you one before the chiefs clear the line?" Blake waved him off. "I'm good, Lieutenant, thanks." The young man saluted and disappeared. The Admiral's eyes shifted back to the far corner of the courtyard. David Mason, the Iron Ghost, was seated now, his son beside him. The two talked quietly, the younger man occasionally laughing, the elder mostly listening. There was something profoundly normal about them, and that normalcy made the mystery deeper. Blake took a breath, squared his shoulders, and walked back toward them. "You're an admiral, Thomas," he told himself. "You command fleets, for God's sake. You can talk to one man." When he reached the table, he smiled politely. "Mind if I join you?" David gestured to the empty chair. "Please." Blake sat, folding his cap on the table. The younger Mason stood. "Sir, I'll grab you both coffee." As the lieutenant walked off, the 2 older men sat in silence for a moment, listening to the music. The air between them felt thick with unspoken recognition. Blake broke the quiet first. "Iron Ghost. Haven't heard that name in 20 years." David's mouth curved in a small, almost reluctant smile. "Didn't expect to hear it again either. I read reports signed under that call sign when I was a commander in Bahrain," Blake said. "Everyone thought you were gone." David looked toward the horizon, the fading sun painting the ocean orange. "Sometimes disappearing is the only way to keep living." Blake studied him, his steady hands, the scar near his knuckle, the faint tremor in his left wrist. There was no arrogance, no hunger for acknowledgement. Just stillness. "I'll be honest," Blake said softly. "When I first saw you, I thought you were just another proud dad. I even cracked a joke about call signs." He gave a self-deprecating chuckle. "Probably not my best moment." David shrugged. "You meant no harm." "Still," Blake said, shaking his head. "If I'd known." David's gaze returned to him. "You would have acted differently. But that's the point. Admiral legends belong in stories, not in living rooms." The words sank deep. For a moment, the 2 men simply watched the sky shift from gold to indigo. When the younger Mason returned with coffee, Blake accepted the steaming cup gratefully. "Lieutenant," he said, "you never mentioned who your father was." The son smiled awkwardly. "With respect, sir, he didn't want me to." "I understand," Blake said. "You're following some heavy footsteps." The young man laughed quietly. "He never made me feel that way. Said the ocean doesn't care who you are. It tests everyone the same." David looked proud, but remained silent. Blake took a slow sip. The bitterness of the coffee grounded him. "You know," he began, "I once trained under Commander Vance. He used to talk about a mission in the Hindu Kush operation. Night Arrow. Said a lone operator kept an entire enemy platoon busy for 6 hours so his team could extract civilians. That man was never named." David's jaw tightened just slightly. "That was a long time ago." "So it was you," Blake said quietly. David didn't confirm, but his silence was answer enough. Blake exhaled slowly. "They told us it was impossible. No one believed a single SEAL could hold that position alone." David finally spoke. "I didn't hold it alone. I had ghosts with me." Blake frowned. "Your team?" My brothers, David said. 2 didn't make it back. The rest of us made a promise to stop chasing glory and start living quietly. I was the only one who kept it. The Admiral's throat tightened. He'd read the casualty list from that op. 2 names, Chief Petty Officer Turner and Specialist Ramos. Brave men. He remembered feeling distant sympathy then. Now it felt painfully real. Your son must be proud, Blake said, his voice rougher than he intended. David looked at the younger Mason. I'm proud of him. He chose his own path, not mine. The lieutenant glanced at his father with quiet admiration. He says every man earns his own call sign. Blake smiled faintly. Wise advice. For a few moments, conversation drifted to lighter things, deployments, training routines, the unbearable Navy coffee. The tension eased, replaced by an unspoken respect. Then a group of junior SEALs approached the table, laughing loudly, unaware of the undercurrent between the 2 older men. Admiral, one of them said, saluting with exaggerated flair. Sir, we're taking bets on who had the toughest call sign in the old days. Care to share yours? Blake laughed. Mine? Nothing fancy. Hammer. Because I had a habit of breaking things that weren't supposed to break. The group chuckled. And you, sir? One asked, turning to David. The younger Mason started to intervene. Guys, but before he could, Blake raised a hand. Careful, gentlemen, he said, a grin tugging his mouth. This man's call sign already froze me once today. The SEALs looked confused. Sir? Blake nodded toward David. You're looking at Iron Ghost. The laughter stopped as quickly as it had begun. The young operator's expressions shifted from amusement to disbelief. Iron Ghost? One whispered. No way. David offered a faint, almost embarrassed smile. Way too much fuss over an old name. The eldest of the group, Chief Mendoza, took a slow step forward, his eyes wide. Sir, your mission reports were in our training manuals. You're the reason we study silent extractions. David gave a small nod, uncomfortable under the attention. Blake leaned back. Told you, boys. Careful who you tease at these things. The group stood at attention for a moment, unsure what to do, before saluting sharply. David returned the salute without standing, a gesture humble yet powerful. As they left, Blake turned to him. You see? Legends have a way of finding daylight, whether you want them to or not. David chuckled quietly. Daylight fades fast, Admiral. That's why I stay in the shade. The words lingered. Blake realized that every war left 2 kinds of men, those who wore their scars proudly and those who buried them under silence. David Mason belonged to the latter, the ones who carried invisible weight so others could walk lighter. The band shifted songs. The ceremony was winding down. Families began to gather near the stage again for the evening address. Blake glanced at his watch. I'm supposed to say a few closing words, he said reluctantly. But after this conversation, I'm not sure I can improve on anything you've said tonight. David stood slowly. Just speak the truth. That's enough. The Admiral nodded. You'll stay for the closing, I hope? I will, David said. But no more introductions. Blake smiled. Deal. As the 2 men shook hands, Blake felt something stir inside him, a renewed sense of humility, a reminder of why he'd joined the Navy in the first place. Command, medals, and titles meant little beside a man who'd chosen silence over fame. When Blake took the stage again, the microphone felt heavier than before. He looked at the faces before him, young, old, proud, and weary. Before we close, he began, I want to say this. Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones you'll never hear about. They're the fathers, the mentors, the ghosts among us who've already given everything. He paused, his gaze flicking briefly toward the back of the crowd where David stood, half hidden by shadows. "We owe them not applause, but understanding," Blake said softly. "Because true courage doesn't need an audience." The audience erupted in applause. Some clapped, some simply stood in silent respect. Blake stepped back, heart pounding not from nerves, but from gratitude. As the applause faded and the night deepened, the Admiral spotted David and his son quietly leaving through the side gate, blending into the darkness. Blake didn't call out. He simply saluted from afar. And somewhere in that fading light, the legend of Iron Ghost became real, not as a story told in whispers, but as a man who had walked among them, laughed among them, and then, as always, disappeared into the quiet. The next morning, Coronado was quiet again. The flags hung motionless in the soft dawn breeze, and the courtyard that had been full of laughter and stories just hours before was now scattered with folding chairs and empty coffee cups. Rear Admiral Thomas Blake walked alone down the pier, coffee in hand, the sound of his boots clicking against the wooden planks. The Pacific stretched out before him, vast, endless, calm. Yet inside his mind, the ocean wasn't calm at all. It was a storm of questions, echoes, and a name that refused to fade. Iron Ghost. He'd heard it countless times before, in debriefs, in training manuals, in whispered stories among new recruits who weren't sure if the man ever existed. The call sign belonged to someone half legend, half shadow. No photo, no rank listed, no confirmed status. Just fragments of mission reports, stamped classified, Omega clearance only. Blake had never believed in myths. But last night, one had looked him straight in the eye. He took another sip, feeling the bitter warmth slide down his throat. Iron Ghost? He murmured aloud, the name tasting heavy. "Talking to yourself again, Tom?" Blake turned. Commander Harris approached, wearing sunglasses and holding a clipboard. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. "Morning, Harris," Blake said. "Still cleaning up from last night?" "Yeah. The logistics team's wrapping up." "You heading to HQ?" "Soon." Harris studied him for a moment. "You look like a man with something stuck in his head." Blake chuckled. "You ever hear of a SEAL named Iron Ghost?" Harris raised a brow. "Everyone's heard of him." "You're not going to tell me he was at the reunion?" Blake nodded. "He was. No kidding?" Harris whistled low. "I thought that guy was dead." "So did I," Blake said quietly. "Turns out he's been alive, living under his real name. David Mason." Harris blinked, stunned. "Mason? As in Lieutenant Mason's father?" "Exactly." "Holy hell," Harris muttered, shaking his head. "That explains the kid's discipline. Runs like he's got steel in his veins." Blake smiled faintly. His old man probably trained him since he could walk. They both stood in silence, the sound of distant calls filling the space between their thoughts. Finally, Harris asked, "What are you going to do with that information?" Blake looked out toward the horizon. "I'm not sure. But something about his story doesn't sit right. A man like that doesn't just disappear without reason." Harris frowned. "Careful, Tom. Some doors in this business are sealed for a reason." Blake gave a quiet laugh. "You know me. I've never been good at leaving doors closed." By noon, Blake was seated inside a secure wing of the base, the records division, where old mission files were stored under strict clearance. He flashed his ID, signed 2 forms, and stepped into the cold, humming archive room. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each labeled with dates, operations, and regions. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The smell of dust and paper filled the air, the ghosts of decades of secrets. "Looking for something specific, sir?" the archivist asked, a young ensign who clearly didn't know who he was dealing with. "Operation Night Arrow, Afghanistan, circa 2003, Blake said. The ensign nodded, typing rapidly into a terminal. That one's flagged, sir. Classified Omega clearance. Blake flashed his badge again. You're looking at Omega clearance. The ensign hesitated, then unlocked a drawer with a metallic click. Inside were 3 thick folders, each marked with a bold red stamp, "Debrief incomplete." He handed them over, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Blake carried the folders to a small reading table, sat down, and began to flip through the first one. The words leapt at him. Teen Raven 6. Extraction mission. Civilian rescue. Enemy ambush. Then a name. Operative D. Mason. Call sign, Iron Ghost. He read the next line slowly. Mission summary. Declassified fragment. Team Raven 6 was compromised during insertion. Operative Mason continued solo. Extracted 5 hostages from enemy compound 42 kilometers northeast of the drop zone. Enemy casualties. Unknown. U.S. casualties. Turner, Kia. Ramos, Kia. Operative Mason returned with partial data drive. Refused commendation. Requested discharge. Blake sat back, stunned. A mission like that should have earned the Medal of Honor. Instead, it ended with silence. He flipped to the next page, a hand-signed note from a superior officer. Recommendation denied. Subject exhibits signs of trauma and isolation. Requests privacy. All records sealed under Directive 17B. Directive 17B. Blake knew that one well. It was reserved for operations too sensitive to reveal, or too painful to retell. He closed the file and rubbed his temple. So Iron Ghost hadn't vanished because of scandal or failure. He'd vanished because he'd chosen to. Because he couldn't carry the noise anymore. That evening, Blake found himself walking down the same beach where the reunion had been held. The sun was low again, waves glowing orange as they rolled in. And there, sitting on a bench overlooking the surf, was David Mason. Mind if I join you? Blake asked. David turned slightly, recognizing the voice. Not at all. Blake sat down beside him. Neither spoke for a while. The sound of the ocean filled the quiet, steady and eternal. I read your file, Blake said finally. David smiled faintly. I figured you would. You should have been decorated for that mission, Blake said. Medal of Honor, maybe even more. Why didn't you let them? David kept his gaze on the waves. Because the men who deserved it were gone. You don't hang medals on ghosts. Blake nodded slowly. Still, you saved lives. I also lost some, David replied softly. Those weigh heavier. There was something in his tone, not bitterness, but acceptance. A calm that only came from surviving what others couldn't imagine. You know, Blake said after a moment, you've become a legend in the SEAL community. Recruits study your missions like scripture. David chuckled. Stories grow taller every time they're told. The truth smaller, quieter. Blake glanced at him. And what is the truth? David turned, meeting his eyes. That we do what we must, and when it's done, we go home. That's all. The rest, glory, fear, memory, it belongs to the world, not to us. Blake looked down, ashamed of his earlier joke, his casual arrogance from the night before. When I asked you about your call sign, he said quietly, I thought I was being funny. David shook his head. You weren't disrespectful, Admiral. You were human. We forget that humor is how soldiers survive the noise. Don't lose that. The two men sat in silence again as the last of the sunlight slipped beneath the water. Blake finally stood. If it's all right with you, he said, I'd like to tell your story, not for medals or speeches. Just for the record, so the truth isn't buried. David gave a tired smile. Admiral, my story's already been told. Every young SEAL who puts on the uniform carries a piece of it. That's enough. Blake hesitated, then nodded. You really do live like a ghost. Better that way, David said. Ghosts can't be disappointed. Blake turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you're the reason I joined in the first place. David looked at him curiously. Blake continued, when I was a lieutenant, I studied your mission logs. I remember thinking, if there's even one man out there willing to go through that for others, then that's the kind of leader I want to be. David said nothing, but his expression softened, the faintest flicker of gratitude. Take care of yourself, Iron Ghost, Blake said finally. David smiled faintly at the nickname. Take care of the living, Admiral. As Blake walked away, the waves rolled in again, erasing his footprints as quickly as they appeared. Behind him, the man who had once been Iron Ghost sat watching the ocean, as silent and steady as the tide. 3 days after his conversation with David Mason, Rear Admiral Thomas Blake couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing something. He had read the files, talked to witnesses, and even stared at the classified photos until his eyes burned, yet the story felt incomplete. There was a silence inside the reports, a space where truth should have been. So, he went deeper. Blake was now in Washington, D.C., sitting in a windowless briefing room at the Pentagon. The air was thick with recycled oxygen and tension. Across from him sat Director Evelyn Cross from Naval Intelligence, a woman with sharp gray eyes that seemed to read through every man who crossed her desk. You've been digging, she said flatly, closing the folder in front of her. I'm looking for answers, Blake replied. She tilted her head. About Iron Ghost? Yes, about why a man like that disappeared. Cross exhaled slowly. You of all people should know, Admiral. Some stories aren't meant for daylight. Respectfully, Mom, Blake said, leaning forward. I don't buy that. If there's truth buried with this team, it deserves to be known. She studied him in silence. Then, with a faint smile, she said, You really haven't changed, Blake. Still the officer who asks too many questions. Sometimes questions are all that's left. Cross stood, walking to a secure cabinet. She entered a code and removed a black envelope sealed with red wax. She placed it gently on the table. This, she said, is the only existing copy of Operation Night Arrow's complete mission transcript. It was erased from every digital system 20 years ago. Mason was the last man to see it. If I let you read this, you never speak of it again. Understood? Blake nodded once. Cross handed him the envelope and left the room without another word. Blake hesitated for a long moment, his pulse rising. Then he broke the seal. The first page was a mission briefing dated August 17, 2003. Objective: extract 5 American contractors captured by insurgents in northern Afghanistan. Team: Raven 6, Mason, Iron Ghost, Turner, Ramos, Lee, and Dawson. Status: nighttime insertion. Stealth priority. Intel: hostiles armed with advanced U.S. weapons. Unknown source. Blake's eyes narrowed. Unknown source. That was always code for something went wrong on our end. He kept reading. Hour 2300. Team inserted 2 clicks south of the target zone. Hour 2345. Encountered unmarked convoy. Presumed hostile. Hour 0005. Team compromised. Explosive detonation. Turner and Ramos key. Mason orders retreat. So far, it matched the declassified summary. But the next page, Hour 015, Mason disobeys direct order to extract, return solo. Hour 0140, mission control loses contact. Hour 0410, Mason reappears at extraction point, covered in blood. 5 civilians alive, 1 USB drive recovered. No comment on missing team members. Then came a line written by hand, in pen, not typed. Recovered data indicates U.S. involvement in weapons leak. Mason ordered silence under threat of prosecution. Operation sealed under Directive 17B. Blake froze. His throat tightened. The U.S. had armed the enemy, whether by mistake or corruption. An iron ghost had stumbled upon it. Instead of celebrating his heroism, they'd buried him to protect their own. He felt sick. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights reflecting in his weary eyes. All those years, the SEALs had spoken Mason's name with reverence, and he'd been living as a ghost, because he refused to expose the corruption of his own command. That was the real reason he disappeared. Not trauma, not disgrace, silence. Later that night, Blake sat alone in his hotel room overlooking the city. The envelope lay open beside him on the table. Outside, the lights of Washington flickered like restless stars. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it. He just stared at it, at the reflection of a man who had once believed in clean lines between right and wrong. He picked up his phone. After a long hesitation, he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Blake?" came a familiar voice, deep, rough, and calm. "David," he said quietly. "I know the truth now." There was silence on the other end. Then David spoke, his tone soft but steady. "Then you know why I stopped fighting." "You didn't stop," Blake said. "You just fought differently." David gave a short, weary laugh. "I did what I could. But they made it clear. Speak out, and they'd destroy everyone on my team's records. I couldn't let that happen. They'd already given everything." Blake's hands tightened around the phone. "You shouldn't have had to carry that alone. Someone had to." "Let me make it right," Blake said, his voice trembling with conviction. "The truth deserves to be known." David paused. "And if you do, what happens to you? To the teams serving now? I don't care about me." "You should," David said softly. "Men like us don't last long once we start tugging at the wrong threads. Let it rest." But Blake couldn't. He'd spent a lifetime commanding men who trusted him to lead with honor. If the foundation of that honor was cracked, he needed to fix it, even if it meant breaking himself. "David," he said quietly, "you once told me ghosts can't be disappointed. But I can." The line went silent for several seconds. Finally, David said, "Then promise me something, Admiral." "What?" "When you tell my story, tell it like it belongs to all of us. Don't make me the hero. Make it about the ones who didn't come home." Blake swallowed hard. "I promise." 2 days later, Blake stood before a memorial wall at Naval Base Coronado. Rows of engraved names shimmered under the California sun. Men who had fought and vanished into memory. He placed his hand on 2 names near the center. Turner. Ramos. Behind him, footsteps approached. He didn't turn. "You found what you were looking for," David's voice said quietly. Blake nodded. "I did, but it's not what I wanted to find." David stood beside him, looking at the same names. "The truth rarely is. Do you regret it?" Blake asked. David smiled faintly. "Every day, and never at all." They stood there in silence for a long time. 2 men bound by secrets and ghosts. Finally, Blake said, "You know, when I first saw you that night at the reunion, I thought you were just another veteran trying to relive the past. But now, I realize you're still carrying the weight of it." David looked at him. "A SEAL never puts down the pack. We just get used to the pain." Blake took a deep breath. "I can't let your story die in those files, David. Not this way." "You'll risk everything," David warned. Blake nodded. "Maybe that's the point." David sighed, his eyes on the horizon. "Then I hope you're ready for what comes next, Admiral. Because the truth isn't the only thing buried." And with that, the man once known as Iron Ghost walked away again, just as quietly as he had reappeared. His silhouette faded into the sunlight, leaving Blake alone before the wall of names. the sound of the wind whispering through the flags above. Blake closed his eyes and whispered, "Then I'll follow your shadow, Ghost, even if it leads into the dark." The promise lingered in the air, a vow that would change everything. Rear Admiral Thomas Blake had seen war in all its forms: sandstorms in Kandahar, chaos in Baghdad, silence in the Pacific. But nothing felt as dangerous as the quiet that now surrounded him. Ever since he'd returned from Washington, his gut told him one thing: someone was tracking him. He noticed it first on the drive back to Coronado. A black SUV had tailed him for nearly 20 miles, always staying 3 cars behind. When he slowed, it slowed. When he took an unexpected turn into a gas station, it disappeared, only to reappear minutes later near the base checkpoint. He told himself it was paranoia, but in his world, paranoia was often survival. 2 days later, Blake sat in his office at Naval Base Coronado, staring at his computer. He had written a resignation letter 3 times and deleted it 3 times. The words never felt right. He couldn't walk away, not when the truth about Iron Ghost and Operation Night Arrow was still buried. The door opened quietly. Commander Harris entered, holding a manila folder. "You wanted this pulled from archives?" Harris asked. Blake nodded. "Yeah, any intel tied to Night Arrow, especially contracts or private arms deals around that time." Harris looked uneasy. "You realize that's pushing clearance boundaries, right?" "I'm aware," Blake said evenly. "Close the door." Harris shut it and sat down. "What's this really about, Tom?" Blake leaned back, eyes heavy. "You ever wonder how insurgents got U.S. weapons during those early years? I used to think it was supply chain leaks. But it wasn't. It was us." Harris frowned. "Us? Not the Navy, contractors. Government-backed companies testing distribution channels. They armed local militias, then called it stabilization strategy. Only it backfired. People died. Mason's team walked straight into the mess." Harris stared at him. "And Mason found out." "Exactly. He brought back proof, that USB drive in his report. But instead of a medal, they silenced him." The room went quiet. Finally, Harris spoke, his tone grim. "You planning to expose this?" "I'm planning to make sure history remembers the right men," Blake said. Harris looked at him like he was looking at a friend standing on the edge of a cliff. "Tom, you go down this road, you'll lose your stars. Maybe worse." Blake gave a faint smile. "Then I'll just be another ghost." That evening, Blake drove to a small safe house on the outskirts of San Diego, a nondescript building once used for covert SEAL training. Now, it served as his personal war room. He opened his laptop and connected an encrypted drive, one he'd copied from the Pentagon's archives before leaving D.C. The drive contained fragments of emails, redacted contracts, and a list of private arms dealers linked to Operation Night Arrow. One name appeared again and again: Blackridge Solutions. Blake frowned. He knew that name. Blackridge had been a consulting partner for naval logistics 2 decades ago. Now a billion-dollar defense contractor with friends in Congress. He clicked on a document labeled Confidential Procurement 03B, the signature. At the bottom made his stomach drop. Vice Admiral Conrad Hill. Hill, his mentor, his superior, and one of the most respected officers in the Navy. Blake's jaw clenched. The man who had written him recommendation letters, who'd attended his promotion ceremony, had also been part of the cover-up that destroyed Mason's life. He sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The truth wasn't just buried, it was protected by the highest ranks. Later that night, Blake drove to a quiet neighborhood near La Yola. He parked 2 blocks from a small white house with a porch light still burning. David Mason's home. He hesitated, then got out and walked to the door. When Mason opened it, he looked both surprised and unsurprised, as though he'd been expecting him. "Admiral," Mason said softly, "you shouldn't be here." "I found something," Blake said. "Something you should see." They moved to the kitchen table, where Blake set down a folder of printed documents. Mason skimmed them in silence. His jaw tightened at the name Blackridge. "I knew it," Mason muttered. "Turner tried to tell me before we lost him. Said he saw crates marked U.S. Logistics in the enemy camp. They were ours." Blake nodded grimly. Hill signed off on the weapons transfers. Mason closed his eyes, grief flickering across his face. "Hill, of course. Why didn't you say something back then?" Blake asked quietly. Mason looked up, his gaze sharp. "Because when I tried, Hill himself came to see me. He told me if I said one word, they'd erase my entire team's records, make it like we never existed. So I took the silence. Better one ghost than six." Blake felt the weight of it hit him, the guilt, the loyalty, the impossible choice. "I can't let him get away with it," Blake said. "Not anymore." Mason gave a slow shake of his head. "You're playing with fire, Admiral. Men like Hill don't just retire. They remain. They've got roots in the system." "I'm not afraid of him," Blake said. "You should be," Mason replied. "Because if they silenced a legend, they won't hesitate to silence an admiral." The next morning, Blake walked into his office and froze. His computer was gone. So were the files on his desk. A note lay on his chair, typed in plain black ink. "Cease all independent investigations. Return to Washington immediately. This is not a request." There was no signature, but Blake didn't need one. The shadow of Vice Admiral Hill stretched over every word. He tore the note in half. Then he turned to the window, where the same black SUV he'd seen days ago sat idling near the gate. The war had begun, not on a battlefield, but in the corridors of power. That night, Blake drove back to the beach. He stood alone under the moonlight, the waves whispering against the sand. Every instinct told him to stop, to burn the files and walk away before it was too late. But he remembered Mason's face. The men on the memorial wall. The ones who never got their truth. He pulled out his phone and dialed a secure number. "Harris," he said. "Tom, where are you?" "Doesn't matter. Listen carefully. I'm sending you encrypted files, proof of Hill's involvement. If something happens to me, you send them to the media. Every outlet you can find. Tom, promise me." Silence. Then Harris's voice, heavy. "I promise." Blake ended the call and looked up at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, Iron Ghost had walked away from everything for honor. Now it was Blake's turn. He whispered to the wind, "You carried the silence, Ghost. I'll carry the storm." As he turned to leave, headlights flared behind him. A black SUV rolled up the beach path, its engine low and deliberate. Blake's heartbeat steadied. He didn't run, didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, watching as the door opened and two men in suits stepped out. "Admiral Blake," one of them said coldly. "You've been ordered back to D.C. for reassignment. Immediate transport." Blake's lips curved into a small, fearless smile. "Reassignment. That what we're calling it now?" The man's expression didn't change. "Sir, please come with us." Blake looked out one last time at the sea, the same sea where David Mason once stood, letting the waves erase his past. Then he turned and walked toward the car. He knew he was walking into the lion's den. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He was done being another man who obeyed the silence. The ride to Washington took nearly 5 hours. The SUV's tinted windows offered only fragments of the world, outside brief flashes of headlights, dark forest, the blur of wet asphalt. Rear Admiral Thomas Blake sat between two men in suits, wrists free but presence caged. No one spoke. Every hum of the engine felt like the measured tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. When they reached the Pentagon, dawn was just smudging the horizon. The men escorted Blake through a side entrance few ever used. No salute, no badge check. Everything was already arranged. Inside, the corridor was silent, cold, metallic. Blake could smell disinfectant and bureaucracy. At the end of the hall waited a steel door guarded by two Marines. One of the men scanned a card. The lock clicked. "Admiral Hill's expecting you," the taller agent said. Blake stepped inside. The conference room was large and windowless. Screens lined one wall, showing nothing but the Navy emblem. At the head of the table sat Vice Admiral Conrad Hill, immaculate in uniform, silver hair gleaming, posture straight as a mast. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas," Hill said smoothly, "good to see you. You've been busy." Blake didn't sit. "Why the secrecy?" "You could have just called." Hill chuckled. "I prefer private conversations when officers under my command start trespassing in restricted files." "I was looking for truth," Blake said. "About Operation Night Arrow." "Truth," Hill repeated, leaning back. "Dangerous word, that. Everyone thinks they want it until they see what it costs." Blake met his gaze. "Tell me, Conrad, how many good men had to die so Blackridge Solutions could pad their contracts?" For the first time, Hill's expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I have your signature," Blake shot back. "Procurement 03B. You armed the insurgents. Mason's team walked into your mess. You silenced him to protect the deal." Hill stood, slow and deliberate. "Watch your tone, Admiral. You're treading on classified ground." "Classified," Blake said bitterly. "That's what we call corruption now?" Hill's eyes were cold steel. "You've forgotten your oath, Thomas. We serve the institution. Not ghosts, not guilt, not stories that make the Navy look weak. We serve honor," Blake countered. "Without it, the institution is nothing." For a moment, silence. Then Hill said quietly, "You disappoint me." He turned to the agents. "Escort Admiral Blake to Holding Room C. We'll decide how to proceed." The men stepped forward. But Blake didn't move. Instead, he placed a small data chip on the table. "I already sent copies of everything," he said calmly. "If I disappear, they go public." Hill froze. It was the first crack in his composure. Blake smiled faintly. "I learned from the best, sir. Cover your six." Hill's jaw tightened. "Get him out." The agents grabbed Blake's arms, but he didn't resist. He'd planted the seed. That was enough. Hill knew now that the story couldn't be buried, agat completely. They locked Blake in a windowless holding room deep underground. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A single camera blinked red in the corner. He sat on the bench, breathing slowly, centering himself the way SEALs did before a dive. He wasn't frightened, just alert. An hour passed. Then two. No one came. Finally, the door opened. But it wasn't Hill. It was Evelyn Cross from Naval Intelligence, the same woman who'd given him the sealed envelope days earlier. "Admiral," she said softly, closing the door. "You've stirred up a storm." "I expected that," he replied. She sat across from him, setting a thin folder on the table. "I warned you to leave it alone. I don't regret it." "I know," she said, almost with pity. "Which is why I'm here." She slid the folder toward him. Inside were photographs, satellite images, coded coordinates, a grainy picture of a man leaving a storage facility near the docks. "Who's that?" Blake asked. "Contractor tied to Blackridge," Cross said. Name's Lars Gruner. He's scheduled to move hard drives containing Night Arrow's operational logs out of the country within 48 hours. Evidence? Everything, she said. Emails, payment trails, shipping records. But if Hill gets them first, it's gone forever. Blake looked up. Why are you helping me? She hesitated. Because once upon a time, I believed in what the Navy stood for. Before men like Hill traded integrity for profit. He closed the folder. Where's the facility? Baltimore Harbor. Warehouse 12. Tonight. Blake stood. You're letting me walk out? Cross smiled faintly. You were never officially here, Admiral. But if you're caught, I won't be, he said. Hours later, rain lashed across Baltimore's industrial district. The air smelled of salt and rust. Blake crouched behind a row of cargo containers, dressed in civilian black, his breath fogging in the cold. He hadn't felt this alive in years. Through the rain, he saw 2 trucks idling outside Warehouse 12. Armed guards moved between them, rifles slung low. Blake counted 6 professional, ex-military. He needed backup. He reached for his Kung device, but stopped. He knew one man who'd answer. He dialed a secure frequency he hadn't used in a decade. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Admiral? David, Blake whispered. I need a hand. A pause. Then, quietly, send me the coordinates. 30 minutes later, a motorcycle engine echoed in the distance. David Mason Iron Ghost arrived like a phantom in the rain, helmet visor glinting under the streetlight. He parked silently beside Blake and pulled off his helmet, revealing eyes calm as the sea. I thought you said you'd carry the storm, Mason murmured. Could use a ghost in it, Blake replied. Mason cracked a faint smile. What's the play? Warehouse 12, Blake said. 2 trucks, 6 guards, possibly more inside. They're moving files that tie Hill to Blackridge. Mason scanned the area, his instincts sharp even after years away. Same old tricks. Flashbangs in the vents, diversion on the north side, extraction on the water. Blake grinned. You haven't lost it. Pain never leaves, Mason said quietly. Just waits for a reason. They moved like shadows. Blake took the north side, planting a small timed flash device under a loading dock light. Mason slipped through the back, cutting the power lines. In less than a minute, the compound fell into darkness. Move, Mason whispered through combs. Guards shouted, scrambling to restore power. The flashbang detonated, flooding the yard with white light and confusion. Blake and Mason darted through the chaos, slipping inside the warehouse. Rows of crates and computers lined the interior. In the center, a man in a raincoat packed hard drives into a metal case. Lars Gruner. Mason moved first, silent, efficient. 2 guards went down before they even realized anyone was there. Blake advanced, pistol drawn. Drop it, Gruner, he commanded. The man turned, startled. You don't know what you're doing, Admiral. I know exactly what I'm doing. Gruner hesitated, then raised his hands slowly. Do you have any idea who you're crossing? Yeah, Blake said. People who forgot what the uniform means. Mason secured the case. Got it, he said. But before they could leave, headlights flared outside SUVs multiple. Engines roared. Mason looked at Blake. Guess he'll send friends. Then we finish this fast. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the rain. Blake dove behind a crate, returning controlled bursts. Mason moved like a wraith, weaving through shadows, neutralizing targets with surgical precision. For every round fired, 2 fell silent. When the last echo faded, the warehouse was littered with empty shells and rainwater. Blake exhaled. You good? Mason nodded. still breathing. They loaded the metal case into Mason's pack and vanished into the night, sirens wailing faintly in the distance. Hours later, safe in an abandoned boathouse on the Chesapeake, Blake opened the case. Inside were drives labeled Blackridge Finance, Op Night Arrow, contract signatures, proof, everything. Mason leaned against the wall, exhausted but calm. You realize once this goes public, you'll never wear that uniform again. Blake smiled faintly. Maybe that's the price for finally serving it. Mason nodded. Then let's finish what we started. Outside, dawn broke over the harbor gray, solemn, steady. 2 soldiers, one retired and one fading into myth, watched the light rise and knew there was no turning back. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the boathouse windows, illuminating the exhausted faces of Rear Admiral Thomas Blake and David Mason. They had survived the night, retrieved the hard drives, and now faced the most dangerous part, making the information public. Blake studied the drives, running his fingers over the labels. Blackridge Finance, Operation Night Arrow, contract signatures. These files weren't just evidence. They were proof of corruption at the highest levels of the Navy and government contractors. Once this goes out, Mason said quietly, Hill won't just stop at sending thugs. He's got lawyers, politicians, and agencies ready to bury anyone who touches this. Blake nodded. Then we move fast. Secure server. Anonymous leak. The world deserves the truth. They drove through the early morning streets in a nondescript van. Mason handled navigation, while Blake monitored communications on an encrypted laptop. Every street corner seemed a potential ambush. Blake couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were following them. It wasn't paranoia. They weren't alone. About 20 miles outside Baltimore, the van slowed. A sleek black sedan appeared behind them, keeping pace. Blake glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 men in dark suits leaned forward, eyes hidden by sunglasses. They've found us, Blake muttered. Mason didn't flinch. Not yet. He pressed a hidden button on the dashboard. A series of smoke grenades deployed from the back of the van, instantly shrouding the road in thick gray smoke. The sedan swerved, losing sight of them. Blake exhaled sharply. That worked a little too well. Mason chuckled faintly. Better than bullets in the chest. They reached a small data center outside Washington, D.C., a safe house run by an old intelligence contact. The facility was dimly lit, humming with servers and security cameras. Blake handed over the drives to the technician, a wiry man named Carter. You're taking a huge risk letting me do this, Carter said, glancing nervously at Mason and Blake. Not as huge as the risk if Hill gets these first, Blake replied. Within minutes, Carter uploaded the drives to multiple secure networks, encrypting the files and preparing a simultaneous leak to several media outlets. Blake and Mason stood silently, watching the progress bar inch across the screens. Outside, the hum of DC traffic went unnoticed. Then the screens went dark. Blake's stomach dropped. What happened? Carter's hands trembled. Firewall breach. Someone's inside. They've disabled the upload. Mason's eyes narrowed. Too fast. That's not luck, that's professional. Blake's mind raced. Hill. He has someone inside. Maybe even here. Before Carter could respond, the door burst open. Armed men in tactical gear stormed in, shouting. Mason reacted instantly, flipping a chair as a shield. Blake drew his sidearm and moved to cover. The men were well trained, precise, clearly ex-military. One of them grabbed Carter and dragged him toward the exit. Blake fired 2 shots, taking down a man advancing on Mason. Mason disappeared into the shadows, neutralizing another. Blake realized the truth too late. The leak was compromised from the start. Someone on the inside had betrayed them. Hours later, after a chaotic firefight that left the facility damaged but still standing, Blake and Mason regrouped in a hidden alley behind the center. Blake's voice was tight with anger. Someone tipped them off. Carter wasn't clean. He was feeding Hill intel the entire time. Mason's jaw tightened. I sensed it. Too smooth, too compliant. We should have vetted him longer. Blake shook his head. We were running blind. Hill knows everything about Operation Night Arrow. He'd have planned for an insider. Mason paused, looking at the Admiral. We still have the drives, right? Blake checked his satchel. They were intact, but the weight of betrayal pressed down on him. Yes, but Hill's reach isn't just local. He'll send more men, and he'll use every tool at his disposal. For the first time, Blake realized they were outnumbered and outgunned, but not outsmarted. That night, they sought refuge in a safe house Mason had prepared years earlier. The air was tense. Outside, the city never slept, but inside, two warriors plotted their next move. Blake unpacked the drives. We can't stay here. They'll track the signal from Carter's upload attempt. Mason leaned against the wall. We split up. You take the drives. Go off-grid. I'll draw them away. By morning, they'll be chasing ghosts again. Blake's eyes widened. You'll never make it alone against Hill's people. Mason smiled faintly. I've never done anything else. You trust me, don't you? Blake nodded. More than anyone alive. They mapped out the plan. Blake would leave by boat, heading down the Chesapeake to avoid surveillance. Mason would create diversions, attacking Hill's operatives in small, precise skirmishes designed to buy time. At dawn, Blake slipped out of the safe house, carrying the drives in a waterproof satchel. The harbor was quiet, mist rising from the water. He boarded a small skiff Mason had prepared. As he pushed off, Mason appeared at the edge of the dock, waving a hand. Blake hesitated. Be careful, he shouted. I always am, Mason replied. The sound of engines roared behind them. Hill's men had discovered the safe house. Mason turned to face them, crouched low, and fired. Blake could see Mason's figure vanish into the shadows as gunfire lit up the dawn. His heart pounded not with fear, but with awe. The man had become what the legends had always said, unstoppable, untraceable, a ghost. Hours later, Blake reached a secluded inlet. He connected the drives to a secure uplink, encrypting and sending the files to multiple independent journalists, watchdog agencies, and international media outlets. Each transfer completed was a victory, a small surge of justice. Finally, when the last drive uploaded successfully, Blake exhaled. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of silence lift. The world would know the truth of Night Arrow and the men who had been erased. But even as he sat in the skiff, exhausted, a shiver ran down his spine. Mason had not returned, and Blake knew in his bones. The man who once carried the call sign Iron Ghost was still out there, fighting battles no one would ever fully see. Blake held the final photo Mason had given him at the reunion, a faded picture of the SEAL team, Turner and Ramos smiling before deployment. Blake whispered softly, You survived. Ghost, now it's your turn to rest. And somewhere in the shadows of the city, Iron Ghost disappeared again, leaving only a whisper of movement, a phantom presence, and the unbreakable legacy of the man who refused fame, yet demanded honor. By mid-morning, the world had begun to change. News outlets across the globe were alive with stories about Operation Night Arrow, Blackridge Solutions, and the Navy officials implicated in the decades-long cover-up. The files Admiral Blake and David Mason had risked everything to secure were now public. Headlines screamed corruption, heroism, and secrecy. Inside the Pentagon, chaos reigned. Meetings were called, offices cleared, and a storm of investigations began to dismantle the intricate web of deceit. Vice Admiral Conrad Hill had been placed on immediate suspension. The documents clearly proved his involvement in illegal arms transfers and obstruction of justice. Blake sat in his office, exhausted but resolute, watching the unfolding events on the news. Somewhere in the city, Mason observed the same broadcasts from a safe distance. He stayed in the shadows, as always, letting the world bear witness to his actions while remaining unseen. He had no desire for recognition, no need for accolades. The truth had been told. That was enough. Blake, however, knew the man behind Iron Ghost deserved more than anonymity. He had flown to Coronado later that week, arriving just before the sun dipped below the horizon. He walked the same pier where he had first met Mason, recalling their first conversation, the moment when a casual joke had revealed a legend. And there, leaning against the railing, looking out over the Pacific, as though the waves carried all the memories of the past, was David Mason. Blake approached quietly. "You never asked for this," he said. Mason turned, offering a small, faint smile. "I never do. I want you to know," Blake said, voice steady, "that the world will remember the truth. Not the cover-ups. Not the lies. Your story, your sacrifices, won't be buried anymore." Mason looked at the horizon, silent for a long moment. "The world doesn't care about ghosts." "Some do," Blake replied. "Some do." Mason's eyes softened slightly. "Then thank you. For the living who remember." Back in Washington, Hill's empire of silence crumbled. Congressional hearings revealed the scope of Blackridge's operations, implicating multiple officials. Prosecutors moved swiftly. Hill, once untouchable, now faced trial for conspiracy, obstruction, and endangerment of American personnel. Blake had testified, presenting the documents he and Mason had risked their lives to recover. The courtroom was tense, Hill's steely demeanor cracking under the weight of irrefutable evidence. When the verdict came, the media had already begun dubbing the case the Night Arrow Scandal. Hill was convicted on multiple counts, stripped of his rank, and sentenced to prison. For the first time in decades, accountability had reached the highest echelons of power. At Coronado, life slowly returned to normal. Recruits trained, veterans shared stories, and the ocean remained an eternal backdrop to lives built on service and sacrifice. Blake had received commendations for his courage, not for the battles he fought overseas, but for the moral battle he waged at home. Yet he never boasted, never displayed pride. His satisfaction was quiet, personal, reflective. Mason never appeared in public. Not a single photograph of him surfaced. He remained the ghost he had always been, unseen, untouchable, immortal in memory alone. One evening, Blake sat in the base mess hall, sipping coffee quietly. Recruits laughed, sharing stories of missions and training mishaps. He listened, smiling faintly. Some of them reminded him of Mason's team, the men who had never returned. Some reminded him of Mason himself, unassuming, patient, lethal when necessary. He felt a presence beside him, though no one had approached. "Admiral Blake," a calm, familiar voice said. Blake looked up. Mason stood there, leaning against the doorway. His posture relaxed, his eyes steady. "You didn't have to come back," Blake said softly. "I wanted to see the light," Mason replied. "You did what ghosts rarely get to see, the world reacting to their work." Blake chuckled faintly. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Mason said. "But you carried the weight when it mattered most." They shared a long silence, the room bustling around them, yet the two men remained anchored in their own quiet world. "You ever think about retiring?" Blake asked. Mason shrugged. "Ghosts don't retire. They just fade." Blake nodded. "Then you've done well to leave the storm behind." Mason's gaze lingered on the recruits. They'll carry the legacy now. That's enough for me. Blake smiled. They'll never forget Iron Ghost. Mason tilted his head. They shouldn't. And if they do, they'll still feel the echo of every sacrifice. That's all any of us really leave behind. Months passed. The Navy rebuilt trust, cleaned up the remaining corruption, and honored the fallen. Operation Night Arrow became part of history taught in briefings as a cautionary tale of courage, loyalty, and the cost of silence. Blake continued his service, mentoring young SEALs and officers, quietly reshaping the Navy's culture of honor. He never sought recognition for exposing Hill. The reward was knowing he had done what was right. Mason, true to form, remained unseen. But sometimes, on quiet nights along the pier, Blake swore he could feel the presence of the man who had been Iron Ghost, watching, approving, a silent guardian in the shadows. One evening, Blake stood alone on the pier, staring at the Pacific as the sun dipped below the horizon. He thought of Mason, of Turner, Ramos, Lee, Dawson, and every man who had walked into darkness for the sake of others. A whisper of wind rustled the flags overhead. Blake felt a sense of closure. The world knew the truth. The ghosts had been acknowledged. He smiled faintly. "Rest now, Ghost," he whispered. "You've earned it." And somewhere beyond the waves, where only the ocean could witness, David Mason vanished once more. No ceremony, no recognition. Just the quiet fulfillment of a life lived in service, honor, and sacrifice. The legend of Iron Ghost would endure, not in medals or photographs, but in memory, in stories, and in the living legacy of those who had survived to carry the torch forward. The SEAL Admiral had joked about a call sign once. That joke had led him to the man who defined courage and integrity, the man who proved that sometimes the quietest heroes cast the longest shadows. And with that, the light of justice and truth finally illuminated the long shadow of the ghost.